What if a single photograph could expose a murder so shocking that Boston's most powerful family would kill to keep it buried? Behind the ornate mahogany doors of Beacon Hill's wealthiest homes, a secret was about to surface, one so dark that Boston's elite would kill to protect it. In 1887, Edgar Hartwell, a respected photographer known for his memento mori portraits, was called to the Peaton mansion. He believed it would be routine, a final photograph of Cornelius Peaton, the family's powerful patriarch. But once his glass plates were developed, what emerged wasn't the peaceful image of a man at rest. It was evidence of murder. The photographs revealed bite marks hidden beneath his fingernails, defensive wounds carefully covered with makeup, and worst of all, a face twisted in terror, proof that Cornelius had recognized the people who killed him. The fortune he left behind, worth millions today, had been secured through betrayal and blood. And now, the Peaton family would stop at nothing to ensure their photographer never walked out of Boston alive. The city in 1887 was a place caught between eras. Gas lamps flickered on cobblestone streets while electric lights were just beginning to appear downtown. Telegraph wires stretched overhead like a metallic web, carrying messages at speeds unimaginable a generation earlier. Beacon Hill stood as the crown jewel of New England aristocracy, where shipping fortunes, textile mills, and banking dynasties secured their legacies through shrewd marriages and ruthless business. Reputation meant everything, and no family represented that power more than the Peatons. Cornelius Peaton had built an empire through questionable trade routes, harsh mills, and iron-fisted deals. By the time of his death at 73, he controlled banks, railroads, and law firms, and his influence reached deep into politics and the church. His home reflected that dominance. A 4-story brownstone with marble staircases imported from Italy, chandeliers from Vienna, silk wallpaper from France, oil paintings by European masters, and Persian rugs laid across polished mahogany floors. A staff of 12 servants maintained the place like clockwork. For Edgar Hartwell, the commission came by telegram on a gray February morning. Cornelius Peaton, deceased. Immediate memorial photography requested. Highest compensation assured. The Peaton seal in blue wax gave it weight. This wasn't just another client. Photographing Boston royalty would mean prestige and money. He packed his tools carefully. The large format brass camera with its leather bellows, felt-wrapped glass plates, bottles of silver nitrate developer and fixer, and his portable lamps. Then he set out through the streets toward Beacon Hill, the wheels of carriages clattering over cobblestones, bare elms casting sharp patterns against the cloudy winter sky. The Peaton mansion rose like a fortress. Granite blocks formed its base, iron railings lined its steps, and its tall windows glared coldly onto the street. Inside, the air smelled of perfume and flowers, but also of embalming chemicals, sharp and metallic. Heavy curtains smothered natural light, leaving only gas flames to flicker against burgundy silk wallpaper. The door was opened by Wilhelm Krauss, the family butler. Thin, gray-haired, his hands trembled as he took Edgar's coat. His accent was faint, but his unease obvious. "The family is distraught," he said quietly. "They are in the morning room. Mr. Peaton's remains are prepared upstairs." Hartwell followed him up the marble staircase, polished so bright it reflected the flicker of the lamps. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of boards beneath Persian rugs, the whisper of Krauss's shoes, the faint hiss of gaslight. In the master bedroom, Cornelius lay dressed and arranged for mourning. To a casual observer, it was a portrait of peaceful death. But Hartwell's practiced eyes noticed more. Makeup concealed faint bruises. His fingernails bore the marks of a desperate struggle. His face was frozen in horror, the unmistakable expression of a man who had died knowing the hands that ended his life. The Peaton family wanted a dignified memorial. What Hartwell captured instead was the truth, that Cornelius Peaton had been murdered, and his own family was responsible. When the glass plates dried in the chemicals of Hartwell's darkroom, the evidence was undeniable. Those images could expose Boston's most influential dynasty, and that meant Edgar Hartwell had just become the most dangerous witness in the cit. The Peatons weren't just burying a patriarch. They were burying their crime, and now they would do whatever it took to bury the photographer too. So what began as a final tribute, a photograph to hang in a parlor, turned into a deadly struggle for survival in the gaslit streets of Victorian Boston. What if the family gathered around a deathbed weren't mourning at all, but covering up a crime? That was the uneasy thought that crept into Edgar Hartwell's mind the moment he stepped deeper into the Peaton mansion. The butler's words had the polished calm of a man used to managing visitors during tragedies. But something about the way he spoke felt rehearsed, like lines memorized from a play. And as Hartwell walked down the long second-floor hallway, the walls themselves seemed to be watching him. Portraits of Peaton ancestors lined the corridor. Ship captains, merchants, stern ladies in empire gowns, revolutionary officers. Generation after generation staring down, silently reminding anyone who passed that this family's wealth and influence went back as far as Boston itself. The master bedroom was no less imposing. It was practically a shrine. A massive mahogany bed, its frame carved with anchors and ships to boast the family's maritime fortune, dominated the room. Midnight blue silk hung over the canopy. Cornelius Peaton himself lay stretched out in full evening dress, black tailcoat, pearl-studded shirt, silk cravat tied in his signature Windsor knot. The funeral director had done his job well. Hair combed, waxy complexion smoothed with makeup, hands folded neatly across his chest. To anyone else, it might have looked like a portrait of dignity. But Hartwell noticed the oddities right away. The curtains had been drawn long before his arrival, keeping the daylight out. The air carried the sharp sting of carbolic acid, a chemical often used to hide stronger, fouler odors. And the entire room had been rearranged, not simply to make space for photographs, but staged, as if someone had carefully designed the scene like a painting. The butler, Wilhelm Krauss, explained that the family had made very particular requests. Each member wanted to be photographed with Cornelius in a way that reflected their special bond. He even held a sheet of handwritten notes, Margaret Peaton's script, detailing the poses. Almost on cue, the family began to file in. Margaret, the widow, was striking even in grief. Steel-gray hair twisted up with tortoise-shell combs, her black gown glittering with jet buttons and delicate beadwork. She looked every inch the society matron, yet her hands trembled as she positioned herself at the bedside. "I want to be photographed holding his hand," she told Hartwell, her voice strong, but her darting eyes betraying nerves. "We were married 34 years. No one knew him better than I did." One by one, the children followed. The eldest, Theodore, was 38, sharp jaw, polished attire, but eyes too calculating to hide. His Savile Row coat was immaculate. His Oxford shoes gleamed under the gaslight. Yet Hartwell noticed mud clinging stubbornly to the leather. Odd, for someone who had supposedly been at home grieving. "I should be photographed with my hand on his shoulder," Theodore announced, puffing himself up beside the corpse. As his heir and partner, I was his right hand in everything. The pose didn't look like mourning. It looked like possession. Then came Frederick, the youngest at 25. Unlike his brother, he was jittery, restless, drumming his fingers against his leg. His request startled Hartwell, to kneel beside the bed like a child at prayer. "Father always said I was his favorite," Frederick muttered. But the flash of resentment in his sibling's eyes told a different story. His words sounded more like a desperate defense than a memory. Finally, Constance, the daughter, around 30, pale and worn thin from recent strain. Her fashionable dress hung loose on her frame, her face shadowed with exhaustion. She asked to place a white rose on her father's chest, leaning down as if to kiss his forehead. The request struck Hartwell as unsettlingly intimate. "Daddy always called me his little princess," she whispered through shaky breaths, "even when I disappointed him with my choice of husband." That single confession suggested battles within the family, far more personal than business. All afternoon, Hartwell worked. Exposure after exposure, glass plate after glass plate. The Peatons posed with Cornelius like actors in a play, each one more concerned about how they looked than about honoring the dead. Their grief seemed staged, their sorrow rehearsed. And in the quiet moments, when Hartwell was preparing his equipment, he overheard whispers not meant for him, Margaret muttering urgently to Theodore, "The will must be changed before anyone else knows." Frederick snapping back, "We need to move quickly, before the lawyers start asking questions." And Constance, her voice sharp, "Keep everything quiet. No one outside this room can ever find out." These weren't words of grief. They were words of conspiracy. Even the butler couldn't keep his composure. Kraus grew more rattled with every passing hour. His hands trembled so violently adjusting the curtains that he nearly tore them down. Sweat rolled down his temple despite the February chill. When Hartwell gently asked about the timeline of Cornelius's death, Kraus stammered, his voice cracking. It was sudden. Very sudden. We're all still adjusting to the shock. But Hartwell knew shock when he saw it. This wasn't shock. This was fear, and standing there, behind the camera, watching the Petons pose like actors around their patriarch's corpse, Edgar Hartwell realized something chilling. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was evidence. Evidence of secrets the Petons would do anything, absolutely anything, to keep buried. What happened next would put Hartwell himself in mortal danger. So, before we continue deeper into this deadly story of money, power, and murder in Victorian Boston, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Because trust me, you'll want to hear how this nightmarish portrait session turned into a fight for survival. What if the peaceful death of Boston's most powerful man was anything but peaceful? That's exactly what photographer Edgar Hartwell began to realize as the Peton family's story started to unravel. When Hartwell casually asked the butler, Wilhelm Kraus, when Cornelius had passed, the man hesitated. His eyes flicked nervously toward the family, almost as if he needed their approval before speaking. Finally, he whispered, 2 nights ago, sir. In his sleep, the doctor said it was very peaceful. He added that Cornelius had complained of stomach pains that evening, but dismissed it as nothing unusual. On the surface, it was the kind of explanation Boston's upper crust loved. Quiet, dignified, respectable, but to Hartwell's trained eye, something didn't fit. He'd spent years photographing the dead. He knew the difference between the face of a man who slipped away gently in the night and one who fought for his life until the final breath. And Cornelius Peton? He didn't look like someone who had gone quietly. That suspicion only deepened when Hartwell began developing the plates later that afternoon. The family's pantry had been turned into a makeshift darkroom, sealed tight, dimly lit with a ruby lamp, the air thick with the sting of developer and fixer. For Hartwell, this process was second nature. Each glass plate lowered into the bath, and slowly, images appeared like ghosts rising out of nothing. At first, they looked ordinary. Margaret Peton holding her husband's hand, Theodore standing tall, one hand on his father's shoulder, Frederick kneeling in a pose of devotion, Constance bending close with her Rose. Perfectly staged displays of grief, but the camera never lies. On Margaret's portrait, something subtle caught Hartwell's attention. The positioning of Cornelius's hand wasn't natural. It had been placed. And worse, the back of that hand showed a thin, faint scratch. Under magnification, it was unmistakable. The kind of mark left by fingernails during a struggle, not after death. During life then came Theodore's photograph. At first glance it looked regal, an heir claiming his father's mantle. But Hartwell noticed the jacket seam near the shoulder was stretched, almost torn, and on the collar a stain, tiny, dark, but telling. Blood, concealed under powder and fabric, but the camera had preserved it forever. Frederick's portrait was the one that nearly stopped Hartwell's heart. The angle of his kneeling pose revealed Cornelius's profile in a way none of the others did. And what it showed was horrifying. Cornelius's face wasn't peaceful. It was twisted in fear. His mouth slightly open, not in rest, but as if gasping. His eyelids half shut, strained. Beneath the makeup, faint bruises encircled his neck, carefully hidden by a high collar. And his hands, clenched tight into fists, the knuckles locked with rigor mortis. That wasn't the posture of serenity. That was the posture of a man fighting back. By the time Hartwell hung the plates to dry, his mind was reeling. Every detail pointed to the same conclusion. Cornelius Peton had not died quietly in his bed. He'd been attacked, murdered, and the family's performance of grief was nothing but a cover. The next morning, as snow blanketed Boston and muffled the streets outside, Hartwell rushed to his studio. He needed clearer light, sharper lenses, and his magnifier to confirm what he already feared. And when he examined the prints again, there was no denying it. The hands bore defensive wounds. The collar was stained with blood. The face revealed anguish, not rest. Every single frame told the story the Petons were desperate to hide. But it was Constance's portrait, the one with the white rose, that held the most damning detail of all. A clue so small it had escaped notice in the chaos of the mansion. But once Hartwell saw it in his studio, there was no turning back. And what he discovered there would change everything. What if the very photographs meant to honor a grieving family ended up exposing them as killers? That's exactly what Edgar Hartwell realized the moment he studied Constance Peaton's portrait under the glass. She'd leaned down with a white rose, meant to look like a daughter's tender goodbye. But the camera's angle caught something the funeral director never meant anyone to see. Her movement had shifted Cornelius's high collar, just enough to reveal faint bruises around his neck. Not random blotches, not shadows, but the clear imprint of fingers. The marks told a story no family wanted told. This wasn't a man who passed quietly in his sleep. It was strangulation, slow, deliberate, face-to-face. An execution carried out with cold precision. Hartwell sat back in his chair, staring at the plates spread across his work table. They weren't memorial portraits anymore. They were evidence. Evidence that Cornelius Peaton's family had hired him, not to preserve their grief, but to accidentally document their crime in detail. Every scratch, every bruise, every lie hidden under layers of powder and silk. The more Hartwell thought about it, the more dangerous the situation became. The motive? Sure, money, but not just money. The Peaton fortune meant control of banks, courts, politics, everything. This wasn't about a will. This was about power, and now he held proof that could bring it all down. As he wrestled with what to do, a sharp knock rattled his studio door. Through the frosted glass, a tall figure loomed. Expensive coat, fine hat, walking stick. Theodore Peaton. He stepped inside with practiced charm, hat in hand. "Mr. Hartwell," he began smoothly, "I wanted to thank you for your sensitivity yesterday. These are difficult days for my family." Hartwell nodded politely, but his hand itched toward the drawer where his revolver rested. Something about Theodore's presence set his nerves on edge. Theodore's eyes scanned the studio like an inspector, lingering on the drying plates, the locked cabinet, the developing trays. He wasn't here to pay respects. He was here to take inventory. "Actually," Theodore said, removing his gloves with deliberate calm, "we've decided we'd like the photographs to remain private. Family only. We'd be happy to compensate you generously for your discretion. All the copies, all the plates, of course." On the surface, it was an innocent request, but Hartwell knew better. Families hired him so they could display these portraits, share them proudly as proof of devotion. To want none of that? It wasn't grief, it was fear. He stalled for time. "I understand, Mr. Peaton, but you see, I usually keep copies for my portfolio. Prospective clients like to see examples." Theodore's smile froze. His tone sharpened. "That won't be acceptable. Privacy is essential to us. I'm sure you'll make an exception." The polite mask was cracking. This wasn't a grieving son making a request. It was a man delivering an order, one backed by power and consequence. Hartwell tried to sound reasonable. "Perhaps we could discuss terms further." Theodore cut him off with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Of course. Take your time. I'll return tomorrow for your decision." He reached the door, then paused, turning back with one last remark. Smooth, but edged like a blade. "My family has influence in Boston. We reward loyalty. We also remember those who disappoint us." The words were delivered with the courtesy of a gentleman, but the threat underneath was clear as day. Hartwell was no longer just a photographer. He was holding the Peaton family's deadliest secret, and they weren't going to let him walk away with it easily. So what would he choose? Silence and safety, or truth and certain danger? What would you do if you realized you were the only person holding proof of a powerful family's darkest crime? That was Edgar Hartwell's reality. After Theodore Peaton's visit, Hartwell bolted his studio door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat surrounded by the eerie glow of his red development lamp. On the table lay the photographs, not portraits of grief anymore, but evidence. Cold, undeniable proof. He wasn't just a photographer anymore. He was holding the Peaton family's secret, and his life was now on the line. The next day felt endless. Hartwell couldn't focus on routine work. Instead, he studied the images over and over, and dug into everything he could find about the Peatons, their money, their businesses, their conflicts, and the picture became horrifyingly clear. Cornelius Peaton hadn't died peacefully in bed. He'd been murdered, almost certainly by his own children, but photos alone weren't enough. To accuse one of Boston's richest, most connected families, Hartwell needed more. His digging revealed that Cornelius had been making changes to his will right before his death. The heirs weren't happy. There were ugly fights about money, about marriages, about control of the family empire. And worse, Cornelius had started questioning suspicious gaps in the family's business records. Missing money, transactions that didn't add up. And who was running the books? Theodore, the son who had the most to lose if the truth came out. As dawn broke cold and gray, Hartwell made his choice. Fear or no fear, he couldn't stay silent. The failed attack at his studio proved it. The pitons wouldn't stop until he was silenced. His only chance was to expose them first, so he worked methodically, making multiple sets of the most damning photographs, each one perfect, each one hidden like buried treasure across the city. One set went to his banker, locked away with strict instructions. Another to his sister in Providence, with a letter that could shatter the pitons if anything happened to him. He wasn't just protecting the truth. He was protecting himself. But the riskiest move? Walking straight into the Boston Police Department with the originals, he asked for Detective Inspector Michael O'Brien, a man known for honesty in a city full of corruption. At first, O'Brien thought it was routine. Insurance fraud, maybe. But as the photographs hit the desk, his face hardened. Strangulation marks, defensive wounds, the terror frozen on Cornelius's face. Once seen, they couldn't be unseen. This is serious, O'Brien warned. The pitons are powerful. If we're wrong, we're finished. But Hartwell didn't flinch. I'm not wrong. Look closer. He didn't die in his sleep. He was killed, and by people he trusted. O'Brien believed him. But he also knew how Boston worked. Too many politicians, too many officers owed favors to the pitons. Charging ahead recklessly could mean disaster. So he ordered a quiet investigation first, gathering evidence before making a move, and that decision would prove fatal because the pitons weren't waiting. Their network of allies and corrupt officials tipped them off within hours. Theodore didn't run. He didn't hide. He acted, swiftly, brutally, and what came next would shake the city to its core. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to know you're walking straight into a trap and still have no choice but to keep going? That's where Edgar Hartwell found himself. One evening, after a late dinner at his neighborhood tavern, he turned down a narrow alley near his studio. That's when three shadows stepped out of the dark. The ambush was fast, precise. Two men grabbed him, pinning his arms, while a third advanced with a knife that gleamed under the gaslight. Hartwell froze. He knew that face. It was the same servant who'd tried breaking into his studio before, and this knife, it wasn't for a clean, quick kill. No, this was meant to be slow, painful, a warning, but Hartwell wasn't defenseless. He'd been expecting something like this. Hidden in his coat pocket was a small Smith & Wesson revolver, compact but deadly. When the knife came close enough, he fought like a man who knew he had only seconds to live. Wrenching free, he pulled the gun. The alley exploded into chaos, shouts, struggling, gunshots cracking against the walls. The flashes lit up the bricks in blinding bursts, like hell itself had opened. When it was over, two attackers were sprawled in the gutter, their blood shimmering in the lamplight. The third vanished into the night, clutching a wounded arm. Hartwell wasn't unscathed. Blood soaked his shoulder from a knife wound, and bruises throbbed across his body. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Police arrived within minutes, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Inspector O'Brien himself stood over the bodies, grim-faced as Hartwell gave his shaken testimony. Both dead men, confirmed to be Piton family servants. Paid killers sent to silence him forever. That was the evidence O'Brien needed. No more hesitation. No more waiting. By midnight, with court-signed warrants in hand, Boston police surrounded the Piton mansion on Beacon Hill. And what they found inside was damning. Margaret Piton was caught in her husband's study, tossing documents into the fire as fast as her hands could move. Flames devoured bank records, letters to crooked politicians, even detailed instructions on how to dispose of Cornelius's body. Theodore? He was at the back door, leather satchel stuffed with gold and bonds, ready to flee Boston on the first train to New York, then vanish across the Atlantic. And down in the wine cellar, police uncovered Frederick and Constance. Frederick, trembling and broken. Constance, cold and unshaken, clinging to her composure like armor. Among their belongings lay Cornelius's original will, proof he had planned to leave most of his fortune to charity, not his greedy heirs. It was over. The family was in chains. Boston's elite reeled. Newspapers splashed the scandal across their front pages. For weeks, the Petons' name was dragged through the mud. Every buried secret rose to the surface: embezzlement, fraud, exploitation of immigrants. Their empire wasn't just wealthy. It was rotten to the core. And then came the trial, the most sensational courtroom drama Boston had ever seen. At the center of it all, Hartwell's photographs. Displayed on easels before the jury, each black and white print told the story better than any words could. The bruises, the terror on Cornelius's face, the unmistakable signs of murder. The defense fought desperately. They hired top lawyers, paraded medical experts who claimed the marks were just natural effects of death or embalming. They tried to spin the evidence into doubt, but the truth was already unraveling them. The family doctor, who'd signed the death certificate, was exposed. He'd been bribed the day after Cornelius's death. Cornered, he confessed everything, and then came the final blow. Wilhelm Krauss, the butler. Nervous, heavy-accented, terrified, but willing to talk. Offered immunity, he described what he'd seen in chilling detail. Step by step, he laid out the murder. When he finished, there was no doubt left. The Petons weren't victims of gossip. They weren't misunderstood. They were murderers, and thanks to a single photographer who refused to stay silent, their empire crumbled in front of the whole world. What if I told you one of Boston's most powerful families murdered their own father during his birthday dinner? That's exactly what happened on February 14, 1887. According to testimony, the Petons had gathered around the table to celebrate Cornelius's 73rd birthday. But behind the toasts and polite smiles, there was tension. For weeks, Cornelius had been digging into shady bookkeeping, and what he found wasn't just sloppy math. It was years of fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal. Worse, he had announced plans to rewrite his will. The fortune wouldn't go to his ungrateful heirs anymore. Instead, he planned to cut them off and leave most of it to charity. For a family obsessed with wealth, that was the ultimate threat. And so, they planned his death. The birthday cake itself was the first weapon. His wife, Margaret, laced it with arsenic, enough to make him violently sick, but not immediately kill him. That was Theodore's job. As Cornelius writhed in pain, clutching his stomach, Theodore slipped a silk tie around his father's throat. While Frederick and Constance held him down, he strangled the life out of him. The struggle was brutal. Cornelius scratched, clawed, fought for air. His hands bore the cuts and bruises of resistance, and his last moments were spent staring into the eyes of the children he had raised, realizing too late that their love had been nothing more than greed. The family thought they'd been clever. They claimed Cornelius had died in his sleep after complaining of stomach pains. A doctor signed off on natural causes. The funeral was rushed and private, and to seal the illusion, they hired a photographer to capture mourning portraits, proof of their supposed devotion. But their plan backfired. That photographer, Edgar Hartwell, wasn't just skilled. He was observant. His lens captured what the eye might miss: strangulation marks, fear etched into Cornelius's frozen face, defensive wounds on his hands. What the Petons thought would protect them became undeniable evidence of their guilt. The trial was sensational. Margaret, Theodore, and Constance were all convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to hang. Frederick, who had only held his father down, was given life in prison with the faint hope of parole. The Peton fortune didn't survive either. The state seized it under forfeiture laws, and much of it was eventually funneled into charities, the very outcome Cornelius had wanted. The executions came on a gray October morning in 1888. Boston's elite turned out to watch. Margaret faced the gallows with icy composure, while Theodore and Constance had to be held up, too weak to stand on their own. And with the drop of the rope, one of New England's most prominent dynasties ended in disgrace. Hartwell lived, but he was never the same. He abandoned memorial photography, scarred by what he had uncovered. Instead, he turned to landscapes and architecture, subjects that carried no secrets, no betrayals. Detective Inspector Michael O'Brien, who had trusted Hartwell's evidence, was promoted to chief of detectives. He often pointed to the Peaton case as proof that new technologies, like photography, could expose crimes even the rich and powerful couldn't cover up. And indeed, this case set a precedent. Hartwell's glass plate photographs became some of the first ever used as direct evidence in an American courtroom. They proved that the camera's cold, unflinching eye could catch truths that people might overlook or try to bury. As for the Peaton mansion, it was auctioned off, then turned into a boarding house for immigrants. Whispers of strange noises and bad energy followed, though most likely it was just the shadow of the family's dark history. By 1900 it was demolished, replaced by an ordinary building with no trace of its past. Others involved weren't so lucky. Wilhelm Krauss, whose testimony had been key, vanished from Boston soon after. Some said he went back to Germany. Others swore he died at sea. Either way, he never resurfaced. In the years that followed, photography became a cornerstone of forensic science. What the Peatons had intended as a cover-up became the very weapon that destroyed them. Hartwell died in 1919, quietly, his obituary, mentioning only briefly his role in solving Boston's most infamous crime. He never married, maybe never could, after seeing what family greed was capable of. Today, his photographs still sit in the Massachusetts Historical Society, a grim reminder that even the most carefully guarded secrets can't survive the cold light of a camera. So what do you think? Did Hartwell truly uncover everything about the Peatons? Or could there have been more victims hidden in their past? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more true stories of greed, betrayal, and horror from America's past, hit like, share this video, and subscribe. Trust me, the next story will chill you even more.